There were many great record labels of the past and during the 78 era. Many had great artists that were recording on them and would somehow affect the industry. Each label had a unique legacy in the long run too. Some labels would end up creating new genres or record formats too. Others were there just to make a buck or two, maybe find the next popular artist. All of them have stories behind them that I think all collectors should know about. One particular label has caught my eye. This one is somewhat known already. This is a story of perseverance, luck, and the most famous dime store label. This is the story of Perfect Records. Well, how about we get into it then? To do that, we need to go back in time to June 1922 in Brooklyn, New York. The French label Pathé Actuel had several different branches and sublabels. They were the same labels that made the 16 through 20-inch records in the mid-1910s. What most all of them had in common at the time was that they were all financially strained. So one branch named Pathé Frères decided to make a separate label, yet still connected to Pathé. Not a sublabel though. The label would sell cheap records at stores for about a dime or so at most. It would also distribute Pathé's unreleased recordings too. So they decided on the name Perfect. Later that month, the label and the company was established. The label's art was just a simple but fancy octagon with the name Perfect printed out, with the P avoiding the border, similar to Actuel. The label started pressing on the 11,000 series. Back then, the records were black shellac, just like every other label. The first few releases would be part of the Uncle Josh monologues by Cal Stewart. But quickly, Perfect got its own roster on the 11,000 series. That included Louis James as Charles Sinway, Elliott Shaw as Frank Sterling, Frank Quinn, the Casino Orchestra, and Cliff Edwards. Pathé's unreleased records would fill up most of the roster. Pathé Frères, overseeing this, decided to make 3 new other series in advance. The 3 others would be the 11,5000 series, the 12,000 series, and skipping 13, going to the 14,000 series. The 11,000 series and the 11,500 series would focus mostly on the Pathé artists, while the 12,000 and 14,000 series was for Perfect artists. The 11,5000 was the same as the 11,000 with a red fade though. The 12,000 series, as far as we can tell, was the first series to get the standard label design as shown here. It's hard to know when the standard label first appeared because the different series would often share it. Anyways, the label would mostly look like this in the future. The design was of 2 women whose hair intertwined into the Greek design bordering the outline. The women are kneeling and praying at the stone arbor. The arbor has heavenly rays of light protruding out of it. The rays project the name Perfect. This would have more changes, but we will talk about those later. The 12,000 series introduced new artists and some past or future famous ones such as Arthur Fields, Irving Kaufman, Ethel Bryant, and Anna Myers. Same with the 14,000 series, introduced the George Foster Orchestra, the Golden Gate Orchestra, the Elite Dance Orchestra, and the Cinco Jazz Band. Then 1922 turned into 1923. 1923 was the first full year of the label being in business. By this time, Pathé no longer had as many unreleased or reformatted releases as they did in 1922. Also this year they would have a few hot records of their own. So for the time being, they were not in hot water financially. Thus, Perfect got more freedom in recording. Also, they got a better budget for promoting themselves. At this point, they would mostly have Pathé sleeves for the records, so they started making more perfect sleeves. Their sleeve had claims such as America's fastest selling record, and they also had the slogan at the bottom, "Better records can't be made." Above that was a picture of people dancing and playing instruments while a conductor was in the background. They were also using a perfect record for the stage too. This step forward in promotion would prove to be a good thing in the future. Also, by Pathé having significantly less releases to put on Perfect, they were able to expand the roster a lot more than the others. This resulted in the 11,000 series and the 11,500 series closed for the time being. There'd be new artists on the 12,000 and 14,000 series, including Lavinia Turner, Harry Blake, Robert Judson, Maggie Jones, Rosa Henderson, and even Vernon Dalhart. 1924 would be an important year for Perfect. The 12,000 series had just recently gotten Vernon Dalhart onto the roster. Though he was mainly a Victor artist at the time, his reissues on Perfect attracted a bit of publicity. That year, Perfect got the original Memphis Five onto the roster, the Van Epps Novelty Orchestra, Amanda Brown, William Rundle, Maureen England, Billy Jones, Fletcher Henderson and his orchestra, and more. Then in August, Cliff Edwards, one of the main and first artists, scored a record on Billboard. The song was "It Had to Be You." It was also one of the first covers of the Isham Jones one. Though the record only charted for 3 weeks, its significance was huge. See, throughout the 1920s, there were the 3 big record labels that would get most all the hits. They were Victor, Columbia, and Brunswick. Then, if there was anything left, OK and Vocalion would get a hit or 2 each. So when a small dime store label, not really known about, get the hit, people were all over it. That one wouldn't be the only one. Cliff would chart 2 more for Perfect, but they would only chart for about a week. Now that the label was becoming known, more artists wanted to record on there. Pathé gave them more financial freedom too. Additions included Lee Morse, Macy and Small, Guy Massey, Al Bernard, and more. And nearing the end of the year, Perfect officially created their own sub-label named the Star Series. This one's purpose was to promote both Pathé and Perfect's most popular records. This is what would be on the majority of the 11,500 series for the most few years. And as the year ended, their motto, "The Perfect Record," reigned true. In early 1925, the Star Series was handling most of Cliff Edwards' recordings. On the 12 and 14,000 series, the Honey Boys, Bart's Mississippians, the Palace Garden Orchestra, Southampton Society Orchestra, Bill Wurges, and more were now recording. But then February rolled around. This time was an important time for the music industry. If you don't know, Columbia made what is arguably the first electrically recorded song ever. This launched the industry into the electrical recording age. All the top labels would ditch acoustic for electric by the end of the year or early 1926. Not only did they shift audibly, they did visually too. Victor went from the old Batwing label to the new Victor Scroll. Columbia went from Blue Wax to the Black Vivatona label. Brunswick made the glorious Light Ray label. OK made OK Electric. And Vocalion eventually made the Blue Full Range Recording label. Perfect and Pathé would not change. In fact, they wouldn't even enter into the electric era. This gave all parts of Pathé a disadvantage, even Perfect. The fidelity of electrically recorded records was much greater and easier to hear than the acoustically recorded records. Also, there was a new process for recording the records. No longer was it that an entire orchestra and a singer was required to play their instruments down a horn into a needle. Now it was into one or more microphones that could pick up more sounds. Their sensitivities could be also adjusted to pick up more or less noise. Overall, it just made recording a lot easier. Naturally, this would draw people away from wanting to record on Perfect, but not entirely. The 14,000 series would have the majority of records released that year. From new artists such as the Birmingham Babies, the Mayflower Serenaders, Joseph Samuel's Music Makers, and the Blues Chasers. The Star Series saw strictly Cliff Edwards and Lee Morris releases for the most part, but Cliff would score a few hits throughout the year that would make it high onto Billboard for a few weeks, including Paddle Madeline Home, Who Takes Care of the Caretaker's Daughter, and Somebody Loves Me. Perfect would make its own small orchestra called the Perfect Salon Orchestra, but it didn't record much, and around the time of Cliff's hits, the 14,000 series ended and the 14,500 series began. For the 12,000 series, the only thing of note really was that Vernon Dalhart was recording a lot on there around the tail end of the year. Only a few more artists would record on there that year: Tom Morris, Ed Small, Bessie Brown, and that's it. 1926 was the first full year of electrical recording in the record industry. Though they were still perfecting the styles, it was clear that that was the way of the future. Most every label is now recording electrically. Well, all the ones that mattered anyways. One that didn't was a recently established dime store label named Harmony, so they still had competition in the acoustic era. Perfect started out the year with a lack of new recordings on the 12,000 series and the 14,000 series. Cliff would score another hit with the song Dinah for 3 weeks on Billboard. That would be his only hit on Perfect this year. It would be the middle of the year when the roster would expand again. The 12,000 series would be the first to get more artists. These would include J.C. Flippin and his gang, the Radio Jacks, Willard Robinson, and Annette Hanshaw. The 14,500 series would gain the Jersey Columbians, Burt Dolan's Chateau Orchestra, Joe Candulo and his Everglades Orchestra, Stillman's Orchestra, Vannon's Orchestra, and the Black Diamond Serenaders. The Star Series had Norton Payne added to their roster, but he only had a couple of records. And around August, Perfect made a new series, the 100 series, dubbed the Race Series, made for race artists and music. The following artists were either transferred or were added to the Race Series: Casino Dance Orchestra, Mamie Harris, Mary Stafford, Duke Ellington's Washingtonians, Reverend Jim Gates, Rose Henderson, Billy Christian's Jazz Rippers, and a few others. The Race Series would release 20 records that year, but that'd be the end of 1926. 1927 started the same as all the years previous, with more artists being added to their separate rosters. The 12,000 was the first of which they got Art Fowler and his Uke, Seeger Ellis, Willard Robinson, and Joe Wilbur. Then came the 14,500. Their new additions included Bill Wurges, the Redheads, Don Voorhees, and too many others to count. The 14,500 had the bulk of the recordings this year. Up until around this time, most of the records by Perfect had that beautiful caramel brown shellac, sometimes with the label having a red or silver fade, while maybe a third of them still had the black shellac. Well, from this point on, it seems Perfect decided to go full-on or almost entirely brown shellac. Around the middle of the year, Cliff would score another hit on the Star Series called Sunday. This would chart on Billboard for about 8 weeks. This would also be the last acoustic hit for the label, because they finally started recording electrically. They wouldn't officially acknowledge this until years later. Later that year, Pathé decided to make a sub-label for Perfect that's strictly for the UK. These were the P300 series and the N95000 series. The P300 series was based in Britain, while the N90000 series was based in France. These records were almost all just American re-releases just under different names. Examples include Willard Robinson and his orchestra re-released as the Lenox Dance Orchestra, or George Hall and his Arcadians as Myers Dance Orchestra. But perhaps the most notable part about the sub-label was the appearance. It was still for the most part the standard label, but it had a red fade, and on the arbel was the Pathé rooster, and above that there were the shadow rays casting out the name Pathé. Not too much is known about these sub-labels, but they stopped producing records in early 1928 because of financial reasons. Back here in America, the Star Series was being discontinued in October, and the whole rest of the year, nothing of note happened and no one was really added to any of the rosters. 1928 was a promising year for the label. That year, the 14500 series would be the first to record with new artists like Bert Dolan and his Berkshire Serenaders, Doc Ross and his orchestra, Jimmy Lytle and the Floridians. By May, the 145,000 series was almost done, so the 15,000 series was created. This one was the same as the other series, but sometimes it had a purple or gray fade on it. The later years, the label design would change, but we'll talk about those when the time comes. The following artists were either transferred or added to the roster of the 15,000 series: Sam Lennon's Troubadours, Deep River Orchestra, the Californian Ramblers, Joe Green's Novelty Orchestra, the Mississippi Music Makers, and the Broadway Broadcasters. The Star Series had been discontinued, nothing more was being made on it, but they were still selling the remaining Star Series releases, one of which was an early 1926 recording by Cliff Edwards of the song When the Red Red Robin Comes Bob-Bob-Bobbin' Along. It was popular enough to reach number 12 on Billboard for 1 week. It would be Perfect's only hit that year. Later that month, the same thing that happened to the 145,000 series was now happening to the 12,000 series. It only released a few records though because it was late December at that point. The design of this series had one really noticeable difference that the other series didn't have. It would be the first to have electric printed on the outermost arch. Also, it had a slightly different border. That December over in France, it was bad news for the parent label Pathé. Over there, they were having such bad times that they sold off their assets and plants to the branch of Columbia. The extent of this would not yet be realized until the next year. "1929 would be one of the most important years of Perfect's operating life. For 7 years it had been running as a dime store label with notable success. And they had a star recording artist too that would issue hits almost every year. And if things got bad, they were always linked to Pathé, so they could help out. But that year, their future was seriously threatened. The threat was this thing called the American Record Corporation, or A.R.C. for short. The A.R.C. was a merger company created by Cameo Record Corporation and Plaza Music Company. Both these companies owned some small labels and some dime store labels like Romeo, Banner, Regal, and Jewel. The idea was for all labels to be controlled by one company, so they could just worry about producing records. Sounds great, right? Pathé certainly thought so. So they joined the A.R.C. around June of 1929, bringing Actuel and Perfect along with them. For the first bit, things were fine. By the next month, the only part of the American Pathé labels remaining was Perfect. The reasoning behind this move isn't clear, but it is safe to assume it was because of Pathé's financial trouble. Pathé would still remain upright overseas, but that's the story for another time. The only upside to all of this, though, was that many other dime store labels that were once big competition to Perfect were now much less. Plus, Perfect, now being its own entity separated from Pathé, had a ton more freedom. Around that same time, Cliff Edwards left Perfect for Columbia. Though he had been making hits on Columbia for years now, he was also pretty much the only artist on Perfect that got on the charts. Without him, they would have a harder time getting noticed by the public. Also now smaller record labels part of the A.R.C. were charting like Velvet Tone and Diva. Maybe it was this reason, or a reason previously discussed, but Perfect ended up opening back up the 11,000 series, which didn't have any new releases since 1922, to focus on other series. Some of the other A.R.C. label artists were transferred. That included the United States Army Band, Eddie Peabody, Adrian Sherbert's Salon Orchestra, and the Aristocrats. Then, if things didn't look bad enough or perfect, October came and went. When it left the stock market in shambles. With all the weight Perfect had to carry, plus now the economic depression that hadn't been rivaled in American history, any educated guess would say that Perfect was on borrowed time.
Lighting our place of love. Night winds seem to have gone.